Hello and welcome to the third edition of the Reinsurance Hot Topics hosted by CCR Re. Our session today is entitled From Natural Catastrophe Modeling to Climate Risk Management. My name is Laurence Barry and I will moderate this roundtable. With us today we have Jérôme Isambard, who is the Chief Risk Officer of CCR Re, David Moncoulon, who is Head of Modeling and R&D Department in CCR, Antoine Mandel, who is the founding partner of Climafin and Professor of Applied Mathematics at Sorbonne University, Nicolas Fournier, co-founder and CEO of Sequentis, an actuary and an expert in climate stress tests, and last but not least, Laurent Clerc, who is the Director for Research and Risk Analysis at the RCPR. A short note before we start, we will be talking a lot about natural catastrophe modeling during this session, and we will probably use most of the time CAT-NAT model, NAT-CAT model, depending on the language. Please bear with us if we use these acronyms a bit too much. And without further delay, I would like to ask Jérôme, CRO of CCR Re, how would you describe for us the management of natural catastrophes as a reinsurer?
Hello, Laurence. I'm very happy to be here, and especially on this topic, which is to my mind high solvency, hot topics for non-life insurance company and further reinsurer in the world. Why it's a solvency topic at first? Because we need to understand our cat risk and especially monitoring our accumulations to follow the risk and to protect the solvency of each company. To do that, in CCR Re, we have an industrial and dedicated process with at first, which is the most important thing for me, it's a dedicated team. Our team has a pivot role between pricing, underwriting, and risk management. And we have in this team diverse profiles, including physical doctor, master, and actuary, enabling an analysis of all modeling issues for various cat markets and perils. With this dedicated team, we need dedicated tools, furthermore. And what is interesting is to have dedicated tools for perils and world area in terms of physical peril and geographic area. So we need to choose commercial model and to develop our own model for non-commercial model which not exist. So we have a sort of galaxy of models, and on these models a sort of accumulation platform which will aggregate all the accumulations on each peril and each area. The name is Tiger Eye in it. To have more details, for example, in 2022 for CCR Re, that was about 400 cedents to be modelized, and on each treaty line that was more than 1 and 6 treaty lines. We can go there. What is interesting on this that is that we use detailed accumulations on address postcode and more aggregate on cresta zone. It's interesting. Why? Because for 2002, that's about 60% of our accumulations which are modelized on address or postcode zone. So it's a very detailed work. What I can do more detail on the next subject, which is for the cat, we need to develop exposure high risk indicator to monitoring our accumulations. In CCR Re, we have two sorts of indicators. The first one is a sort of arithmetic and direct accumulation to follow our engagement on a contractual basis. And on this other side, we have a modelized and statistical exposure vision. and so that we can monitor both sides, the solvency side and the risk exposure side, with the risk appetite of the board. To conclude on our industrial process, I would like to say that it's a continuous improvement process. We need feedback, we need modelization, and we need exposure management, and the three all follow. For example, the exposure management, we have a first subject about data quality, and it's a very important subject. The second is the event response, and we will talk about it in several times, I think. And the third, what is important for me, is to have a sort of calculation industrialization with API, mainframe connections, and all the industrial tools to have a more and more clear view of the risk.
You speak about feedback and exposure management. How do you include within this model some upcoming events, such as, for instance, the earthquake that took place in Turkey in last month? How do you update? Because it looks like it's a lot about statistics. Yeah. Yes,
Laurence, thank you for your question. It's a very important question because, to my mind, in my role of Chief Risk Officer, it's very important to understand that model is not the only way. And Turkey, it's a very good example for that. What I want to say is that, to my mind, the important thing is already to understand the limits of the model. You need the conditions. You need to know the condition of use and not use. You need to feed the necessary and sufficient data, and to be critical on the result. That's what I ask to my young actuaries, to be critical on the result. Yes, to critical, it's simple. You need to analyze the evolution of the results of the model. You need to compare the results with those of the market or other reinsurers. And last but not least, to integrate expert opinions into the models. For example, in CCR Re, we are able to modify some model results or some model input directly in the commercial model, because we think and we are convinced that the model forget something, or because we are convinced by. So the second one is not rely on one but on several models if it's possible, but it's expensive, obviously, and not to forget that it's at first a model result. Concerning the Turkey earthquake, that's very interesting because we have a big commercial model on Turkey earthquake. Turkey is a country which is very earthquake sensible, but after the last earthquake, we didn't use this commercial model. We use a simple model based on footprint event, exposure, destruction rate, and adjustments with setting companies' valuations and different exercise with the companies. Because in fact, in this earthquake, that was not sufficient to use only a commercial model, simply. So we need at first to be very pragmatic, very calm, and use the model with more and more limits, and know the limits of the model. That's clearly the learning of Turkey quake this time.
Thank you very much. So what we described till now is a model that takes the climate as it currently exists. So it's a current situation of climate. But David, if we intend to have a longer view, a longer perspective on what's going to happen with climate change, how do you take the climate into account in the models? How does it get into the picture?
Thank you. In the first place, in CCR, we develop models, exposure models for different natural disasters like floods or drought, hail, cyclones. But we develop this as the rest of the market using historical statistics for the climate, but also for the claim data. And the idea since 2015, with the COP21 in Paris, the insurance market began to ask a question about the future and the evolution of the climate risk due to climate change. And so, with different insurers, we were not alone. We began to ask ourselves how to make projections in the future regarding the exposure that we modelize at current climate for many years. So for that, we began to work with Météo France, which is in France, I think, one of the most specialist, not company, but organism to work on this subject. And the idea was to combine a global climatic model, arpège climat, with our impact models, as we can see on this slide. And the special study that was made for us was to simulate not only the progression of climate change in the future, year after year, because this gives trends, for example, trend of temperature increase or rainfall increase or decrease. But what we want is to have a modeling of the evolution of extreme events. Or today, for example, a 2,000-year flood. What will be this return period in 2050? What will be its intensity? And with continuous simulation year after year, it's difficult to have a view of the extreme events. You have a small probability to simulate the Seine River flood when you simulate only 1 year of 2050. So we ask Météo France to run 1,000 events at current climate and at future climate using different scenarios, RCP 4.5, RCP 8.5, to have many repetitions of the same years, taking into account all the meteorological variability, and to have, or at least to expect, to be able to modelize all the extreme events. We know it's not all the events, but representative simulations. And so we did this for, in the first time, for floods, for drought, for storm surge, taking into account different hypotheses of sea level rise. And this gives us the possibility to map the results. That's the next slide. For example, here we can see on the left the probabilistic river flooding with different return periods and the intensity of flood on a 25-meter resolution. So it's on the whole territory at 25 meters resolution. And we can calculate the probability to be flooded in each part of the territory. And on the right, the same, but for pluvial runoff. And it's something that is not necessarily modelized in the commercial models. They focus on river flood. And in CCR, we have a long experience of claims. And we know that half the claims are located outside the flooded area. Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to develop this runoff model.
Is it correct to say that what you do is probabilistic, whereas what Jérôme was talking about is more statistical, like more historical only, as compared to what you do?
I'm not sure. I think Jérôme also, with his team, does stochastic simulation to modelize the exposure of a portfolio.
Okay.
But I think this approach is more physical. It's more on the simulation of the hazard itself and the representation of the hazard on this map.
Okay.
It's a physical hazard.
Yeah. Okay. So can you give us some examples of how the model is applied?
For example, here you have the location of an industrial site that is compared with flood modelized by CCR and Météo France, where you can see some part of the risk are flooded in case of, for example, a 50-year return period flood, and we have the level of water at each 25 meters squares. And the idea is to be able to give not a notation but a criteria on each site to express its sensibility to climate change, to flood in the first place, but to flood in a changing climate. Mm-hmm. And we use these results for many reasons. First, to work on prevention and to help the public states take into account the evolution of climate in prevention and to map the effect of climate change. And also, we work with insurers and we work with public companies to modelize the impact of climate change on their industries.
Okay, thank you very much. So until now, we've been talking about property damage. And of course, it's not the whole impact of climate change that we can expect. So let's now turn to financial risk, which is the other part of what should be modeled, and how the CatNat model can be used in order to assess the risk on asset value. And for this, we are going to turn first to Antoine Mandel. And I would like to ask you first to describe what is the difference between the property damage risk that we talked about until now and what you are doing, which is financial risks.
Thank you, Laurence. In fact, our models are conceptually very similar to the NatCat modeling approach used for modeling physical damage on properties. But what we are trying to do is to extend the modeling chain to account for the impacts of physical risk and more broadly climate-related risk on the value of financial assets. So the key concept of NatCat modeling, exposure, vulnerability, hazards are the same, but we use them in a slightly different way. So for us, exposure is in general a portfolio of financial assets rather than a portfolio of properties insured by an insurer. Vulnerability is a measure of the loss on the value of the financial assets rather than the destruction of the property. And hazards are potential physical risk. As David was saying, not only historical risk, but also projections of future risk under climate change, or under different climate scenarios. Mm-hmm. And even beyond that, by extension, we are also trying to cover what's called transition risk, which is a form of meta-uncertainty, which is the uncertainty about how policies to mitigate climate change will actually be implemented.
Okay, that's clear. So how do you build such a model of financial risks?
So basically, to build such a model, we need three types of ingredients. Right? So going back to this exposure, vulnerability, hazard paradigm, we need to devise tools and models for each of these dimensions. Okay, so our starting point, as I was saying, is a portfolio of financial assets. And if we, for example, look at physical climate risk on these financial assets, the first thing we need to do is to disaggregate this exposure in terms of financial asset into the underlying production facilities that are the underlying of these financial assets. And to understand how they are exposed to physical risk, we need to locate where the corresponding assets are and how they contribute to the cash flow or how important they are to the balance sheet of the counterparty. I think Nicolas will talk more about this later, but that's the first step in our modeling chain. Second, once we have this mapping of our portfolio of financial assets is implemented, if you want, in terms of physical asset, we need to identify the hazards to which the facilities or the company, if you want, are exposed. And there, using approaches similar to what David is described, we rely on the output of a number of climate impact models. So at one end of the modeling chain, you have temperature and precipitation scenarios, or model of the evolution of temperature and precipitation. And then you have a range of impact models that try to project under those various scenarios what would be changes in the number of the distribution in terms of frequency and intensity of a number of perils related to the climate, like droughts, coastal flood, heat wave, wildfire, a number of hazards that can impact the operation and the balance sheet of companies, right? And so we match these impact models with the breakdown of the asset in a geolocalized manner. We also consider in simulation mode potential adaptation strategies that the firm or the local government could implement, right? To then have a measure of what's the direct impact of hazards under different scenarios on the assets, right? And then basically what the kind of metrics we are interested in this exercise are how the hazard is going to impact the balance sheet of the firm, so destruction of a productive asset, and what's going to be the impact on operations, typically business interruption. And also directly, but also indirectly, those interruption could be also related to supply chain disruption, right? And then the last dimension of what we are doing is to integrate these metrics into financial valuation model. So, given the unfolding in time of a certain scenario and how it relates to certain shocks on the assets or the productivity of the firm, we kind of net present value at a certain stage this impact into the value of the enterprise or the value of its equity. And then using either equity valuation or credit risk model, we try to then assess what's the impact on the value of the financial asset and the value of the portfolio of the firm.
Okay, thank you. So Nicolas Fournier, so your job in this process that Antoine just described is to disaggregate an economic entity into its different units geographically in order to be able to implement the scenario, the physical scenario. Is it correct to say it like that?
Yeah, thank you, Laurence. Exactly. Our job is to compute climate risk, so both transition and physical, for investment portfolios, for insurance companies mostly, but not only. So at the starting point, we have an investment portfolio that we will disaggregate as a portfolio itself. So we will look through all combined package investment inside the insurance portfolio. Jerome knows that very well. Then we will have companies with financial assets, loans, bonds, equities, any kind of financial asset. Then we will go one step further and disaggregate the financial companies. As said Antoine, looking at production unit with individual productions, okay? Because the model at the end, if we can go to the next slide, the model at the end will take a particular activity on a particular location. Yeah. Okay, because as Antoine explained, you could lose production, but it's a time-based loss of the production. If you have a wheat field, you will lose your production of the year. If you have grapes for wine production, it could take 10 years to grow again new grapes to reproduce wines. If you have a nuclear power plant, now it's 20 to 30 years to build up a new nuclear power plant. So the time horizon will really impact. So you have to know not only the location, but exactly what they are producing. Okay, so it considerably increases the amount of data that will be used before computed climate risk. Okay, climate risk, it's not, again, as it's a model with projection, you cannot use statistics to do that. You have to go to each individual point on the maps.
Yeah. So, and if you can you give us an example based on, for instance, the map that David showed us on the Seine?
So on the next slide, on the left side, you have the map produced by David, so showing the probability of a flood for the Seine in Paris. Okay. On the right side, you have, after transforming the physical hazards to financial loss by climate and geolocating all the units, you have what can happen to an individual company, a partial view. It's Unibail-Rodamco, so it's the buildings located near Paris. Okay, so you will see on this map the link with the probability of floods. Okay, at the end, for the overall company, the shock is not so huge. But if you take a particular yellow dot on the map, you may lose the whole building. Okay, so if you have a flood, you may clean up, just say, the building, but you will have to rebuild maybe the electricity inside the building, all telecommunications. So it will cost, and it will block the production for a certain time. If we go to other example,
just a minute.
Yeah.
The table below, which shows the cost, I suppose, right? The percent.
It's a financial loss.
Yeah, and it's percent of what?
It's a percentage of the enterprise value. So if you buy an equity of Unibail-Rodamco, this is what you can lose. And this is a very good question, because we are here in a particular RCP, 4.5 in this example, and a period of time. So it's 10 years. It's not something that you will lose next year or in 2 years or in 3 years. David explains that, and Antoine also. It's something that you can lose somehow in the next 10 years. We don't know when the loss will appear. Again, it's an extreme event that will increase in intensity and frequency due to climate change. But this is something that will happen in the next 10 years. When? We don't know. Okay.
And how do you take into account the fact that there is many sites of the same company, for example, that are flooded by the same flood during the same event?
It will be one, it's a point that is looked by the regulators since a couple of years now, and you have transition matrix to say if you have a flood in Paris, you will have a flood in Rouen, you will have a flood in Le Havre. Today, in the implementation of such model, we are not at this stage of granularity of sophistication. Okay, today we consider all events as independent, and so you have a maximum cumulative event that may happen. Okay, that's one of the future evolution of this kind of models. Okay, to take into account the transition between the events. This is exactly the same when you explain that if you have heavy rain after a drought period, it's not the same consequence as just only an heavy rain. Okay, so it will be the combination of this kind of event for the transition in geographic approach and for the interconnection of the several events one after each other. Yeah. Okay, that's something that is not yet now in this kind of model. There is still a long road. Yeah. No.
Still a long road, but important to take the road.
Exactly. Okay.
Yes.
Another example?
The one you like maybe more. So, to disaggregate companies, you could find companies having 1,000 different locations. Okay, this is the cement and concrete production, multinational company. They are all over the world. Okay, so they have a lot of production distribution units. So to model one single company could at the end give hundreds of data points. Okay, having all a different activity or not. Okay, it really will depend on the companies. Okay, again, at the end, the financial loss, it's not so high. But for some particular example, it's really important. Okay, if we just came back one step, when an insurance company or a bank want to finance, they can finance globally a company or they can finance a particular production unit. So they will have to look really differently to the data. Okay, so if they want to finance or to insure one production unit, they will have to focus on this production unit. Okay, if they want to finance the companies, they will have to look at this kind of map. So now we see the beginning of the first steps in banks for financing, in insurance for a particular location, and they start to take this into account. Okay, so when we say it's a model applied to investment portfolios, it could also be model applied, the same model, okay, but applied by a bank to finance a specific location, a specific production unit.
Yes.
So if we take the last example, you will have company, utilities, I mean electric production. We all know that power plants need water to operate, okay, to warm, to cool, reactors for nuclear power plants, hydroelectricity, etc. So, for example, utilities are really exposed to physical risk. Mm-hmm. So it was to show something a bit different and to say for some companies, okay, because in the first two examples, at the end you have low financial loss, I mean small figures. Okay, we have in the world today companies facing a huge physical risk for the financial loss. Okay, but exactly the same for damage, for property damage. I mean, it's exactly the same situation at the end. Okay. So today, for an insurance company, when we compute at investment portfolio level, at the end, the financial loss due to physical risk will be a small figure. But we will find inside the portfolio some companies facing a huge risk.
Mm-hmm. That's clear. Thank you very much. So with all these models in hand, we now are ready to assess the impact of climate change on a market, on an insurance market. And Laurent Clerc, you are in charge of research and risk analysis at the CCR, and you lead the climate stress test exercise for the French market. Can you give us the main feature of this exercise from the supervisory point of view?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Laurent. So indeed, we run the first pilot stress test exercise. First, I would like to start by the objective of a supervisory authority. So our concern is about financial risk and financial stability. So we have in mind three main objectives. The first is obviously to size the vulnerabilities and the risk, and with a view that there is a possible mispricing or under measurement of financial risk related by climate change. The second objective is to raise the awareness of financial institutions and to improve their preparation. So in this context, we are assessing and making sure that firms are well equipped in terms of methodologies, data, models to assess climate-related risk. And we are also looking at the extent to which they are able to factor in some very specific features of climate change. We alluded to that, which is the fact that climate change will impact very differently firms across the board, sectors, but also geographies. So this is the features that we need to factor in. And in the context of the ACPR, we have also used this stress test exercise to check the consistency and the plausibility of French financial institution public commitments on climate. So regarding the main features of the exercise, so it was the first time a supervisory authority run this kind of exercise. So it introduced many very innovative features. The first is that it was carried out as a bottom-up exercise, meaning that the ACPR designed the scenarios and the main assumption of the climate change stress test, but it was the duty of firms to measure the impact on their balance sheet and their business model. We used 4 different scenarios, one on climate change, on physical risk, which was a business as usual scenario. It was based on RCP 8.5, and we introduced 3 different transition risk scenarios. The reference scenario was that of an orderly transition based on the national strategy to a low carbon economy. And we had 2 disorderly scenarios. A key feature was the long-term horizon. So the scenario were designed at a 30-year horizon, and the coverage was broad since we are dealing with international groups. So it was designed for taking into account their worldwide exposure. A key feature of the exercise of the ACPR was the introduction of a dynamic balance sheet assumption. So this is a very particular assumption where you allow firms, so banks in our case and insurance companies, to take management actions, that is to say, to adapt their portfolio to climate change risk or to climate change policies. So this was a key feature of the exercise. We covered, as I said, both the banking and the insurance sector and tried to look at the interplay between those 2 sectors. And finally, we look at both transition risk and physical risk. So to relate to what was said before, transition risk mostly affect the asset side of an insurance company, while physical risk will mostly affect its liability side. So these are the kind of features that we used.
Yes. Can you looking at the next slide, can you explain to us how the physical risk scenario is included in the stress tests?
Yes. So regarding the physical risk scenario, so we took the following assumption, which was that irrespective the transition policies that will be carried out from now up to 2050, it's very unlikely that those policies will have an impact on physical change at the horizon of the exercise, so 2050. So therefore, we took the most severe scenario based on RCP 8.5. So in order to compute the impact of this scenario, we relied on the integrated assessment model for the world economy. So we worked with, in the context of the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of central bank and supervisory authorities to develop scenarios. So in that context, we worked with a Climate Institute working for the IPCC, and we relied on models like Climada or EasyMIP. And with respect to the impact of climate change on France, we worked with Caisse Centrale de Réassurance, and the model that was presented earlier on by David. Here, the important aspect was that thanks to this model, we are able to, in a way, measure the impact of climate change risk and physical risk in particular at the very granular level. In our case, it was done at the municipality level. And we took account in 4 kinds of different climate hazards, like marine submersion, drought, flood, and tropical cyclones for French Caribbeans.
Okay, and so I understand that this summarizes what you did in the 2021 exercise, and you are preparing now a 2023 exercise. Can you tell us what were the lessons and what you're going to change in the next test that you're doing?
Yes. So in terms of lessons, so we were quite happy about the outcome of this exercise because there was a strong mobilization of the French institutions, in particular insurance companies. But we noted also that there were several challenges that those companies faced. The first one was the challenge of dealing with long-term scenarios and horizons. So we noted that for many insurance companies, some difficulties to project beyond the 5-year horizons, which is a typical horizon that is used in the context of their strategic planning. The second also was to analyze the impact of different scenarios. So what we noted was that at the horizon of 2050, there are only very few differences across the scenarios that we use, especially in terms of transition risk. So the idea is to introduce more variation. We noted also that insurance companies had some difficulties to work at the level of their portfolio. At a very granular level. So that was a challenge that they faced. And then they also typically did not use a lot the dynamic balance sheet assumptions. So that is something that we will come back to. In the next exercise that we will carry out this year, we will still consider both physical and transition risk. One key feature of our exercise compared to what other supervisors are doing is that we are including also health risk. We will be built upon the latest generation of scenarios provided by the NGFS, and we will introduce also a short-term adverse scenario combining several acute physical risk to take into account possible compounding effects. And we will also, in this context, add transition risk. We will probably take into account fewer sectors of activity, but going more granular for some of them, for instance, energy and transport. And we will try to also better factor in market risk, which is something that was not really well accounted for. And finally, that was also a purpose of the first exercise. We will try to improve our understanding, say, of the risk of insurability. So that will be also a key focus of this next exercise.
Thank you. David, I understand that you give the parameters of the physical scenario. Is there going to be something different in 2023 as compared to 2021?
Yes, we had a discussion really in the last week with Météo France, and now we are more focusing on the RCP 4.5 scenario, because we think, and not us, but Météo France and the experts think that the RCP 8.5 is a real pessimistic view of the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, because it's really in a stochastic modeling, in a stochastic model simulations, it's a 90 percentile of the most pessimistic scenario. Mm-hmm. So it's really a pessimistic scenario, and the RCP 4.5 seems to be more relevant with the current CO2 emissions. And so we will focus on this scenario and use the RCP 8.5 as a pessimistic view. We will keep it in the confidence interval, but focus on the 4.5.
Okay.
And we also have the possibility to improve our socio-economic projections. There are many models, climatic models that project the climate in the future, but for socio-economic scenarios, it's more difficult. And so we are closer to 2050. So we have more information to take into account for this projection. So it's an important work that we are doing today in this period to improve these socio-economic projections.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So we are now almost close to the end of this roundtable, and before we close, and as a matter of conclusion, I would like to ask each of you, as experts in climate change, to give me a few words about what he learned from creating and building these models, the experience of these models, and what he would like to improve in the next future in order to make them even more powerful. Jérôme.
Yes, I think first it's clearly a long way, but we need to take this dimension, and we need the models. We need to develop the models, even if we have some uncertainties and some of uncertainties, in fact, because the models are crucial to understand and discover some key point or difficult point for our companies. And it helped us a lot. To achieve, I think it's a very long road, and typically it's clear that for insurance industry, it's a key part of ORSA report and our own risk view. And so, yes, it's crucial view, but very interesting view.
Mm-hmm. It's a challenge. David?
So for me, it's the idea is to combine, that's what I said just before, the socioeconomic projection,
okay.
That consistent with the climate projection, because we can sometimes use a pessimistic climate scenario with an optimistic socioeconomic development, and I think it will be important to have a consistent view of both the side of the modeling.
Okay, great. Antoine?
Yeah. No, I think to build up on a point that was mentioned in the discussion, I mean, the complexity of the feedbacks between the different perils is a very important challenge in terms of modeling. And beyond even, correlation between physical risk or, relationship between different risk drivers, there is also, when you look at the results, in fact, of, different scenario contingent analysis, in fact, the main driver of the magnitude of impact is what's the adaptation policy that is implemented. So I think a lot of these results and these stress testing exercise are also a warning call about the need to also think about adaptation to climate change and to start investing now in protecting the assets that are vital for us.
Thank you. Nicolas?
So yeah, to go a step further, for data used to compute the model, we have to go one step further, looking at all the supply chain. Okay, I mean, now we disaggregate the companies, but companies are using suppliers that are using natural resources. So to have the complete picture, we have to go to the full supply chain for each company. That's a challenge. Mm-hmm. The second point is to take into account management action. Mm-hmm. So we have two parts in that. When we look at an insurance investment portfolio, there will be management action. So when Laurent say, or Jérôme in the ORSA, now you have to project over 30 years, it will not be the same portfolio. So we will have to transform the portfolio over time, to simulate and to be able to compute what could be the climate risk over the next 30 years. But you have exactly the same point for the companies themselves. So it's, again, for the adaptation. If you have some companies planning to close a production unit because it's too exposed, or to transform their business model because they will stop producing coal, very good idea. You have also to take that into account because we are discussing a long-term horizon. So 30 years, you have to take all of this into account. And then it's the next generation, of the model that we have to build up, to apply and to compute.
Big challenge.
Yes.
Laurent, yes. Your final word.
Yes, well, perhaps first I will note the tremendous progress that we have made to carry out this kind of exercises. In our case, for instance, we created the NGFS, the Network for Central Bank and Supervisors, in 2018. And nobody would have bet a penny that we would have been able to carry out a stress test exercise 2 years after the inception of the NGFS. So obviously, it's not perfect yet, but it's doable, and I think it's useful for firms. So, and it was, I think, a key positive aspect of our first pilot. So that's a key point. So we have talked about the complexity. I think it's improving the data collection also, so there will be progresses there. I think a key point is also what we have tried to factor in through this dynamic balance sheet assumption, and the point that was made just by Nicolas on adaptation and management action. So in the case of insurance companies, what we are also trying to look at is the extent to which this kind of exercise can be used also to prevent or to use insurance policies as a preventive also actions to mitigate the impact of climate change. So these are I think the next focus for us.
Thank you. Well, we have now reached the end of this roundtable. I would like first to thank all our participants for their insightful presentations. I would also like to thank our audience for watching us today. I hope you learned as much as I did from this roundtable. And we hope to see you very soon in the next Reinsurance Hot Topics. Thank you very much.